I read a comment the other day that street fights are to the death. There are no rules in a street fight. The major problem when we're talking about street fights and fairness in street fights is defining what a street fight is. Are you discussing a criminal act versus a social act? We've been talking a lot about psychology and mindset in self-defense. And knowing what your boundaries are, knowing and accepting what's fair and not fair when you're acting is really, really important. And these rules are psychological boundaries that we have within ourselves. It's a big deal trying to kill a person though, and I think it's easier said than done. A lot of people think they can do it, but no, it's much easier to say. But there are still limitations to the way that we'll behave, because you can have an argument with an 80-year-old man, for example. Is it appropriate to put a baseball bat in the top of his head? No, and I don't know many people will think that's perfectly acceptable and reasonable. And these rules are psychological boundaries that we have within ourselves. So that takes us on to justification. Justification is an internal mechanism in which we justify our own behavior. I can actually live with it, in other words. Yeah. People confuse criminal violence with street fights, and they are completely different events. When criminals attack you, it's not a street fight. Don't define someone that's robbing you or trying to molest or harm you as a street fight. Street fights, in my definition, tend to be ego battles because I can walk away from those. When someone actually attacks me from a criminal perspective for resources that I may have, be my phone, wallet, or what have you, that is very, very different to an ego battle, to social violence. And that's the issue I have when we start to define what's fair in a street fight. Because even if it's an ego battle and you don't want to fight, but you're still standing there arguing with someone, you're essentially still enabling the fight. So what's fair when someone attacks you in your own self-defense to actually harm or take you away? There are no rules, there's no limitations. That's an obvious statement to make. But it is very different when you're talking about social violence. Gentlemen's rules are where, for example, two people agree that, you know, if you fall over, I'm not going to kick you in the head or whatever, I'm going to allow you to stand up and fight again. But then that becomes a sanctioned fight. That's not a street fight. That's completely different. And we all understand that. So there's three ways to frame a discussion on what's fair in a street fight. The first thing I'd like you to consider is what's reasonable, and that's an external factor to you. We, by law, have a reasonable force continuum. Regardless of what country you're in, you respond in a fair and proportionate way to the acts of violence against you. What's reasonable? Okay, you're in a fight, you've hit the guy, he's fallen on the ground, then you proceed to stamp on his head. Then you pull out a knife and then you start jimmying away. Is that reasonable or unreasonable? These factors will be variable from group to group, culture to culture. What might be acceptable for one person or one group of people may not be for another. So when we're talking about group membership, group affiliation, when we're talking about your internal dialogue on how you justify your violence towards another person, these are what you'll define as what's fair, and we all have limitations on this. Universal norms are quite simple. If someone gives a statement, is it fair to take a baseball bat to an 80-year-old woman, most people would cringe. So the point is, like it or not, there are universal rules that limit our behavior. Whether you think fights aren't fair and that anything goes, and you are going to fight to the death, I guess the reality is that there are no clear-cut rules in a fight. And you can't define that there are no rules because morally and defensively, there are actually always going to be considerations.